Right, so if you'll recall, we're still in the guest column section of Life of Johnson. We're hearing the recollections of, I believe it's an Irish fellow named Dr. Maxwell, Reverend Dr. Maxwell, I believe. And this is because this whole year, Boswell never really interacted with Johnson. So, here we go. This is in the voice now of, I believe, Dr. Maxwell speaking of Dr. Johnson. He frequently exhorted me to set about writing a history of Ireland, and archly remarked there had been some good Irish writers, and that one Irishman might at least aspire to be equal to another. A few good Irish writers. Well, maybe not back then. Now I think we have a billion more better Irish writers than British writers, don't we? He had great compassion for the miseries and distresses of the Irish nation, particularly the Papists, and severely reprobated the barbarous, debilitating policy of the British government, which, he said, was the most detestable mode of persecution. To a gentleman who hinted such policy must be necessary to support the authority of the English government, he replied by saying, "Let the authority of the English government perish rather than be maintained by iniquity. Better would it be to restrain the turbulence of the natives by the authority of the sword, and to make them amenable to law and justice by an effectual and vigorous police, than to grind them to powder by all manner of disabilities and incapacities. Better," said he, "to hang or drown people at once than by an unrelenting persecution to beggar and starve them." The moderation and humanity of the present times have, in some measure, justified the wisdom of his observances and observations. Dr. Johnson was often accused of prejudices, nay, antipathy, with regard to the natives of Scotland. Surely, so illiberal a prejudice never entered his mind, and it is well known many natives of that respectable country possessed a large share in his esteem. Nor were any of them ever excluded from his good offices, as far as opportunity permitted. True it is, he considered the Scotch naturally as a crafty, designing people, eagerly attentive to their own interest, and too apt to overlook the claims and pretensions of other people. While they confine their benevolence in a manner exclusively to those of their own country, and expect to share the good offices of other people. Now, said Johnson, this principle is either right or wrong. If right, we should do well to imitate such conduct. If wrong, we cannot too much detest it. Being solicited to compose a funeral sermon for the daughter of a tradesman, he naturally inquired into the character of the deceased. Him being told she was remarkable for her humility and condescension to inferiors, he observed that those were very laudable qualities, but it might not be so easy to discover who the lady's inferiors were. Of a certain player, a later footnote tells us this is Thomas Sheridan, he remarked that his conversation usually threatened and announced more than it performed, that he fed you with a continual renovation of hope to end in a constant succession of disappointment. When exasperated by contradiction, he was apt to treat his opponents with too much acrimony, as, "Sir, you don't see your way through that question. Sir, you talk with the language of ignorance." On my observing to him that a certain gentleman had remained silent the whole evening, in the midst of a very brilliant and learned society, "Sir," said Johnson, "the conversation overflowed and drowned him." His philosophy, though austere and solemn, was by no means morose and cynical, and never blunted the laudable sensibilities of his character, or exempted him from the influence of the tender passions. Want of tenderness, he always alleged, was want of parts, and was no less a proof of stupidity than depravity. Speaking of Mr. Hannaway, who published an eight... Ooh, an eight... Get a little, graham cracker in my throat there. Speaking of Mr. Hannaway, who published an 8 days journey from London to Portsmouth, Jonas, said Johnson, acquired some reputation by traveling abroad, but lost it all by traveling at home. Ooh, burn. Of the passion of love, he remarked that its violence and ill effects were much exaggerated, for who knows any real suffering on that head, more than from the exorbitancy of any other passion. Okay. He much commended Law's Serious Call, which he said was the finest piece of hortatory theology in any language. Hortatory language. There's a word you don't hear too often anymore. Hortatory theology in any language. Law, said Johnson, fell latterly into the reveries of Jacob Boehme, whom Law alleged to have been somewhat in the same state with St. Paul, and to have been unutterable and have seen unutterable things. Were it even so, said Johnson, Jacob would have resembled St. Paul still more by not attempting to utter them. He observed that the established clergy in general did not preach plain enough, and that polished periods and glittering sentences flew over their heads of the common people without any impression upon their hearts. Something might be necessary, he observed, to excite the affections of the common people, who were sunk in languor and lethargy. And therefore he supposed that the new concomitants of Methodism might probably produce so desirable an effect. The mind, like the body, he observed, delighted in change and novelty, and even in religion itself, courted new appearances and modifications. Whether might be thought of some methodical teachers, he said, he could scarcely doubt the sincerity of that man, who traveled 900 miles in a month and preached 12 times a week, for no adequate reward, merely temporal, could be given for such an indefatigable labor. Indefatigable labor. Of Dr. Priestley's theological works, he remarked that they tended to unsettle everything, and yet settled nothing. He was much affected by the death of his mother, and wrote to me to come and assist him to compose his mind, which indeed I found extremely agitated. He lamented that all serious and religious conversation was banished from the society of men, and yet great advantages might be derived from it. All acknowledge, he said, what hardly anybody practiced, the obligation we were under of making the concerns of eternity the governing principles of our lives. Every man, he observed, at last wishes for retreat. He sees his expectations frustrated in the world, and begins to wean himself from it, and to prepare for everlasting separation. He observed that the influence of London now extended everywhere, and that from all manner of communication being opened, there shortly would be no remains of the ancient simplicity of places of cheap retreat to be found. He was no admirer of blank verse, and said it always failed unless sustained by the dignity of the subject. In blank verse, he said, the language suffered more distortion to keep it out of prose than any inconvenience or limitation to be apprehended from the shackles and circumscription of rhyme. So 2 things I know about Johnson is, 1, he doesn't like free verse, 2, he doesn't like players. That's about it. And he's kind of on the fence about the Scottish people. He reproved me once for saying grace without mention of the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, and hoped in future I would be more mindful of the apostolical injunction. That's a tongue twister. He refused to go out of a room before me at Mr. Langton's house, saying he hoped he knew his rank better than to presume to take place of a doctor of divinity. I mention such little anecdotes merely to show the peculiar turn and habit of his mind. He used frequently to observe that there were more to be endured than enjoyed in the general condition of human life, and frequently quoted those lines of Dryden. Strange cozenage! None would live past years again, yet all hope pleasure from what still remain. Yeesh. For his part, he said he never passed that week in his life which he would wish to repeat, were an angel to make the proposal to him. He was of opinion that the English nation cultivated both their soil and their reason better than any other people, but admitted that the French, though not the highest, perhaps, in any department of literature, yet in every department were very high. Intellectual preeminence, he observed, was the highest superiority, and that every nation derived their highest reputation from the splendor and dignity of their writers. Voltaire, he said, was a good narrator, and that his principal merit consisted in a happy selection and arrangement of circumstances. Speaking of the French novels, compared with Richardson's, he said they might be pretty baubles, but a wren was not an eagle. In a Latin conversation with the Pere Boscovich at the house of Mrs. Cholmondeley, I heard him maintain the superiority of Sir Isaac Newton over all foreign philosophers, with the dignity and eloquence and surprise that learned foreigner. It being observed to him that a rage for everything English prevailed much in France after Lord Chatham's glorious war, he said he did not wonder at it, for that we had drubbed those fellows into a proper reverence for us, and that the national petulance required a periodical chastisement. Footnote here about Sir Isaac Newton. In a discourse by Sir William Jones addressed to the Asiatic Society in Calcutta, February 24, 1785, is the following passage. One of the most sagacious men in their age who continues, I hope, to improve and adorn it, Samuel Johnson, he had been dead 10 weeks at this time, remarked in my hearing that if Newton had flourished in ancient Greece, he would have been worshipped as a divinity. Lord Lyttelton's dialogues he deemed a nugatory performance. That man, said he, sat down to write a book to tell the world what the world had all his life been telling him. Somebody observing that the Scotch Highlanders in the year 1745 had made a surprising efforts, considering their numerous wants and disadvantages, Johnson said, Yes, sir, their wants were numerous, but you have not mentioned the greatest of them all, the want of law. Speaking of the inward light to which some Methodists pretended, he said it was a principle utterly incompatible with social or civil security. If a man, said Johnson, pretends to a principle of action on which I can know nothing, nay, not so much as that he has it, but only that he pretends to it, how can I tell what that person may be prompted to do? When a person professes to be governed by a written ascertained law, I can then know where to find him. The poem of Fingal, he said, was a mere unconnected rhapsody, a tiresome repetition of the same images. In vain shall we look for the lucidus ordo, the cleanness of order, where there is neither end or object, design or moral, nec certa recurrit imago, no definite image recurs. Being asked by a young nobleman what was become of the gallantry and military spirit of the old English nobility, Johnson replied, Why, my lord, I'll tell you what is become of it. It has gone into the city to look for a fortune. This is like the fortune cookies of Johnson here. The aphorisms of Johnson chapter. Speaking of a dull, tiresome fellow, whom he chanced to meet, Johnson said, "That fellow seems to me to possess but one idea, and that is a wrong one." Much inquiry having been made concerning a gentleman who had quitted a company where Johnson was, and no information being obtained, at last Johnson observed that he did not care to speak ill of any man behind his back, but he believed the gentleman was an attorney. He spoke with much contempt of the notion taken of Woodhouse, the poetical shoemaker. He said it was all vanity and childishness, and that such objects were, to those who patronized them, mere mirrors of their own superiority. They had better, said Johnson, furnish the man with good implements for his trade than raise subscriptions for his poems. He may make an excellent shoemaker, but he can never make a good poet. A schoolboy's exercise may be a pretty thing for a schoolboy, but is no treat for a man. Speaking of Boetius, who was the favorite writer of the Middle Ages, he said it was very surprising that upon such a subject and in such a situation he should be magis philosophus quam Christianus, more a philosopher than a Christian. Speaking of Arthur Murphy, whom he very much loves, "I don't know," said Johnson, "that Arthur can be classed with the very first dramatic writers, yet at present I doubt much whether we have anything superior to Arthur." Speaking of the national debt, he said it was an idle dream to suppose that the country could sink under it. Let the public creditors be ever so clamorous, the interest of millions must ever prevail over that of thousands. Of Dr. Kennicott's collations, he observed that though the text should not be much mended thereby, yet it was no small advantage to know that we had as good a text as the most consummate industry and diligence could procure. Johnson observed that so many objections might be made to everything that nothing could overcome them but the necessity of doing something. No man would be of any profession as simply opposed to not doing of it. But every one must do something. He remarked that a London parish was a very comfortless thing, for the clergyman seldom knew the face of 1 out of 10 of his parishioners. Of the late Mr. Mallet he spoke with no great respect, said he was ready for any dirty job, that he had written against Bernig at the instigation of the ministry, and was equally ready to write for him, provided he found his account in it. A gentleman who had been very unhappy in marriage married immediately after his wife died. Johnson said it was the triumph of hope over experience. I think I'm bushed. This guy's chapter goes on for quite a while, so I'm going to take another break in it. If it was just going to end, I'd continue, but looks like it goes on for at least two or three more pages. So the whole year, in fact, of 1770. So until next time, all's wells. That's Boswell's. I'm going to try that out. I don't know. I'm not married to it yet.